Um, Good afternoon. My name is Morgan Williams. I'm the interim chief counsel for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, or like we like to call ourselves, the PHRC. Our executive director, Chad Dion Lassiter, unfortunately was unable to be here today, but he asked that I express my sincere thanks on behalf of the commission for everyone who attended today. The PHRC is the Commonwealth agency that is tasked with enforcement of state anti-discrimination laws. Many people are typically familiar with our work or our role in the employment or housing discrimination context, but we actually have a rather large role in the educational context as well. And we're here today in that capacity. And in Pennsylvania, aside from the federal law that I think many are familiar with, such as Section 504 or the IDEA, in Pennsylvania, there are two civil rights laws that apply in this particular context. And these laws are the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act and the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. Our laws are generally pretty consistent with federal law from an interpretation standpoint. And both of these laws, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act and the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act, protect people in education from discrimination on the basis of race and color, sex, religion, ancestry and national origin, disability, and the use or handling of guide or support animals. So when individuals believe they've been harmed because of discrimination or because of one of these characteristics, they are able to file complaints with the PHRC. And like other law enforcement type agencies, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission will investigate these cases and we will prosecute violations of the law. Sometimes in the educational context, the PHRC may also go into districts and inspect school records, for instance, where it's necessary for us to carry out our work. Or we might pursue violations of the law in the name of the PHRC itself. Those activities are rather reactive, and at the PHRC, we like to do a lot of things in terms of proactive activities. So we conduct a wide range of outreach and training to facilitate equal opportunity across the state and to promote social justice. And so we're here tonight to do just that. We're here to talk about educational equity in the digital learning environment so that the Commonwealth as a whole can ensure that we don't leave any children behind in this difficult time. Our purpose tonight is not to be critical of plans made by educators or parents to educate the Commonwealth's next generation, and it's not to endorse any online, hybrid, or brick and mortar option. Rather, our purpose tonight is to provide a brief overview of the laws that are applicable in the virtual learning environment, to describe some of the successes and challenges we as panel members have seen across the Commonwealth, and to give participants some things to think about and some tools to utilize as we adapt in this ever-changing environment. I do hope today will only be the beginning of this important discussion. I'll ask that you use the chat feature if you would like to network amongst yourselves so that you can share ideas with others across the state. In addition, my email address will be in the chat box. And if you have any questions after the presentation, my email will be posted in that chat function. And I would be happy to get back with you and coordinate with the speakers to answer any questions that we can answer. In addition, you can utilize that email address if you would like to have access to any of the references that we're going to refer to today. Some of the speakers have excellent resources available to parents and educators alike. So if you use my email address and send me an email and ask me to provide those resources, I would be happy to do that for you. As we get started this morning, our first speaker is the Honorable Representative Dan Miller. I am appreciative that Representative Miller has offered his time to us tonight. Representative Miller has made public service an important part of his life. He's served in the Army National Guard. He's a former teacher and public defender, and he was previously a county solicitor. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 2013, and he currently serves on the Education Committee and the Judiciary Committee, as well as the Human Services and the Children and Youth Committees. He's the co-chairman of the Subcommittee on Special Education and the Autism and Intellectual Disabilities Caucus, among others. Representative Miller has received awards for his advocacy for people with disabilities and was awarded the lifetime membership in the PTA. Please, join me in welcoming Representative Miller, and I look forward to hearing what he has to say to us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Morgan. I do appreciate being here with everybody today. I look forward to hearing from so many distinguished people who you have here regarding some of their experiences, ideas, impressions, and understandings. There's no doubt that there is a lot to discuss in relation to special education. I thought perhaps it might be good to just take a step back, at least from my office perspective. I often say that whatever your particular challenges were before COVID, most likely they are worse after COVID. And in special education for far too many kids and families, that is the case. I can't say that February 2020 was sort of the pinnacle of support and progress for many kids who have an IEP in Pennsylvania. Although we clearly have made a lot of progress in 20 years. I was a teacher back in the day. I taught secondary history. I did have some experience in relation to special education practice back then. And I could tell you that my education was now incredibly dated, given the advances and thought and commitments that have been made over those 20 years span. And that's a good thing. I'm glad to know that my education for that topic is so antiquated. And there's been good stuff, right? I also try to keep it simple with people. We talk about what you see and what you don't see, what you use, for our generation when we were in school, what those challenges were like. By the same token, just because more kids with a disability are being educated in the schools, doesn't mean that they're part of the schools. And that is a whole nother layer of issues that we were dealing with or trying to deal with beforehand. So what does that leave us with here now? I am, as mentioned, I am on the Education Committee in the House. We try to bring some attention to special education, and I do an event annually called the Disability and Mental Health Summit here in Pittsburgh. We try to focus a lot of attention. We try to bring bipartisanship to a variety of issues. It's not just education-based, but it is wide-ranging, and special education is part of what we talk about. I try to focus on these types of issues. I think I probably have the most bills that are currently waiting action in the Education Committee, maybe like a dozen or more. Again, not all related to special education, but a lot. Special education struggles in the legislature. And partially that's because of a massive education gap. The reality of it is that for many legislators, everybody comes in with their area of expertise. Too few have an experience in relation to special education. Even those on the Education Committee may have no idea what special education means, or really some of them might not be able to tell you what an IEP actually stands for when they first get on the committee, right? So there's a wide range of things. And by the way, I mean no disrespect in that regard. If you put me on something to do with banking, I'm going to have a gap of knowledge, right? So, but it is inherent upon all legislators that when they are assigned to get themselves up to speed and to be representative of issues that their people are facing. So during this time, of course, with COVID, the schools have been challenged, like many aspects. The parents are challenged, the teachers are challenged, the kids are challenged, whether you have an IEP or not. There's no doubt that there will be a myriad of issues for us to discuss, to deliberate on, to kind of work to improve upon as we learn from our response and hopefully improve upon it as we go along. That being said, if I were to take a snapshot in time for the spring, the overall feedback I got from parents was one of disbelief and immense disappointment. I always think that most special education parents, they take the approach that they are trying to, they don't want to be the squeaky wheel in a lot of ways. They're not trying to act like they're asking too much or being too demanding. They're not looking to sort of be the problem for schools. That's most special education parents are trying not to be. They don't want to be that. And to some way, I think in the spring, you saw that where so many parents were like, it's an emergency, which it is and which it was. So they were willing to sort of like do their part. That being said, unfortunately, what we have seen is, from my vantage point, a complete collapse of special education in the spring, almost no matter where your child went to school. And it's not to say there weren't other examples. It's not to say that there weren't gifted teachers doing tremendous work. But as a whole, the feedback I've gotten has been one of, again, disbelief. Thankfully, I would report that in the fall here, that for much of that, it has improved. So the word I get from parents when they reach out to me is that things are better. Things are still not where they should be, and there is concern as to what has been lost. For example, many parents and kids decided not to do the ESY. They felt that after coming out of a couple months of virtual learning and that to be pushed in for summer in what was in most cases another period of virtual learning was too much. The stress, again, applies on the typical side as well, but the stress for many was too much. The challenges to be there. And as much as some people may be surprised about it too, is, look, man, parents aren't teachers, let alone speech therapists, let alone occupational therapists, let alone everything else that gets wrapped up into somebody's IEP and service plan, right? So I would say that some administrators warned me about that. They said, look, we don't think that, not only were they concerned as to whether or not they could put thousands of their kids onto an online platform for months on end, but they also said that they felt that their program would not be sufficient for most kids with an IEP. Now, obviously, one of the challenges somebody would say is, why did you ever develop an online platform that would not be appropriate for a child with an IEP in the first place? Well, that's a good question, right? But what I've seen is improvement, and I'm glad to see that. But as we sort of get out of the triaging and we get into more of an evaluation of what didn't work, what gaps are there, what has been lost, there are questions, and clearly school districts are concerned. One is they clearly want overall to make sure all their students have a great education. On the other side of it too, there clearly is some financial concerns that without greater help from the state, some in the compensatory side of special education could overwhelm budgets the more people sort of dig into where the problems are. And this assumes that we don't have any, I'll just say, a second period like the spring, where more kids are going to be home for a sizable period of time, and then the subsequent challenges that come in place for that, right? So, so hopefully we're not looking at a deeper crisis in relation to that. So where does that leave us now? Look, in the legislature, the Education Committee, I appreciate the leadership of the majority chair. He's always very respectful to me. And we've done some things. But in my opinion, given the crisis in special education and schools across the board, the legislature is not doing enough. And too much of that has left the school districts in a precarious situation. There are teachers who have called me crying from the stress from the challenges, from the failures that they know and see. There are parents who are overwhelmed and know that certain things cannot work. And there are too many kids, especially as they get older, who are like, how can I just get out of this, rather than appreciate any of the enjoyment of learning that maybe they were finding in other ways. I've had parents in the entire spectrum. Parents call me up and say, I'd rather my kid be able to take get out of school early, skip a year, or just be able to grade out than to go through another year of this. It just wasn't worth it. Again, changes have been made and things are moving in most sectors, but the problems are deep, and the legislature has a responsibility. Unlike in the federal constitution, our state constitution makes it very clear that the legislature has a responsibility to financially provide for our school districts. That's the reality. In decades past, the state would pay more of that account. In decades past, the feds made promises of what they would cover for special education. Both of those promises have not been kept. So school districts and localities are struggling, and the state, with its own financial crisis, is trying to figure out how they can pay the bills, at least in a flat funding sort of scenario. But the reality is flat funding is most likely not going to be good enough for many of the school districts, given the level of needs that they're facing. So there are massive problems. And so I often believe that the legislature should be active more, doing more, debating more, hearing more as to what we can do to assist. And for some kids, both typical and atypical, there's a danger of time not being recovered, of learning not being recovered. And that is incredibly unfortunate, and something to which we run the risk of limiting futures if we do not adapt to this quickly enough. And that's kind of like what we got to see in Harrisburg. I always say, I was a firefighter in my hometown for 14 years. Emergency responses are very understandable. You're never going to get it 100% right in relation to any emergency response. But it is incumbent upon those to learn as they go, to take in new information and process, and to make a better plan, or a deeper plan, a bigger plan going forward. Clearly, in relation to special education, I have concerns. And I would also note too, you mentioned 504 as well. Same thing goes for many of the kids who are going to fall under that umbrella too. Look, our kids in general are something to which we have to be very cognizant of as we shift the sands underneath their feet. Without the appropriate supports, there will be challenges with that. Our kids deserve our full attention for it. So from my perspective with it, as somebody who's responsible to be active from the legislature, I really hope and will continue to call for the legislature and the education committee in particular to be more active to talk about these fronts. And before I pause for others, that also talks about too is a better understanding of how virtual learning of any type can work. There's no doubt in the past, I have said some comments that have been critical of many facets of it. In my experience, when I was working as a county solicitor, many of the children who signed up for cyber learning programs did not find success in it. Instead, I was finding a very narrow sort of a person to which would find that experience beneficial. Not saying it didn't exist, but I did not find it for many. And again, now if this is to be an option, if virtual learning is going to be a necessary fallback, if we get through COVID-19 and we're talking COVID-21, what do we want virtual learning to look like in the special education arena? What does it need to be? What are things that we can learn from this process now? And it will take some collaborative discussions and responses, but an attentive focus to which, again, the legislature, in my mind, hasn't done. But we have to get there with it. Like I mentioned, virtual learning is likely to be a required necessity for the foreseeable future, meaning not that kids have to do it, but school districts have to be ready to provide it. And they have to be ready to provide it for every kid of every ability, no matter where they are. On the tech side, there are issues to which we have to help with that. We clearly have broadband access problems. We clearly have technology problems. It is an embarrassment. I have in my district alone, I have a school district that was up and running within 2 weeks without a problem. I have a school district that took over 6 weeks or thereabouts to go around because they had to beg for computers from a bunch of sources because the need for technology was so great in their school district. That school ended up getting 4 weeks almost less education last year than the other kids in my district because they had to go around and beg for those computers. So on the tech side, we clearly have massive inequality that cannot exist again, and that we have to commit ourselves to ending. We've always accepted a degree of inequality in our school systems. The challenge is that when you have these types of gaps, the degree is too great. And for most of our kids with special education, that degree there can bury people and bury and end opportunities. So we have a lot to discuss in this reality. We have a lot to improve upon. And the quality of services has to be uniformed in the sense that with a real understanding of what it means to provide quality virtual education for every child in the state. So that when an emergency comes up, whether it's 2 months, 2 weeks, or more, that we are confident that there will be no lag, there will be no drop off, there will be no regression. That is not too much to ask for any child or any parent in the state of Pennsylvania. And that's what the legislature has to commit itself to, helping school districts to develop that program, have the resources ready to do it, and have it done quickly, just because of the reality of where we are now in the world and the challenges that we're facing today. So with that, thank you. I try to give you a little broad sort of a view from my perch anyhow, and I'll look forward to being part of the discussion and listening to others.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Representative Miller. The next speaker is Dr. Raquel Yangst. Dr. Yangst was a director of bilingual education program for the Reading School District for 35 years. As a director, she designed and implemented the district's transitional bilingual program for non-English speaking students, which at the time of her retirement enrolled over 1,200 students representing Spanish and 10 other languages. She's been a member of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission since 1978, and she presently serves as the vice chairperson. In this capacity, Dr. Yangst is involved in rendering decisions of the commission, which are adjudicated before the agency. I'm pleased to have with us today one of our judges, Dr. Yangst, and we look forward to hearing what she has to say. Okay, Dr. Yangst, you got to unmute.
Good afternoon.
There we go.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I want to thank you so much for inviting me to be able to participate in this timely and ongoing issue about our concerns for the children so that they are not left behind. As someone who has first knowledge about what it is like to be able to sit down in a classroom and as a college freshman in the United States and not be able to understand a word of what's going on in the class, I feel that I can speak about the problems of the limited English and non-English speaking children in this country. I attend many, many meetings where the education of children is discussed. And it seems that we are always talking about black and brown. However, there are many Latinos who don't consider themselves brown. And we never seem to be talking about what are the problems of these Latino children. I can tell you that in order for a child who comes here as a limited English student or a non-English speaking student to be able to acquire the language that they need, the academic language that they need to be able to succeed in the classroom, all the studies that I have read through the years will tell us that those children need at least 7 years of constant language instruction. And sometimes when people think about English as a second language, what they think about is just teaching English. But when I was director of bilingual education for the Reading School District, I made it very clear that our program, which I had created and designed, was not just to teach English. It was to educate children in the English language. Because they would ask me constantly, how much are you going to keep those children in that classroom? And my answer always was, what child? We know that the children that come here from many parts of countries that speak Spanish have different problems. And some of them because they have never been in school at home. Some of them because they were repeating one grade after another in their home language. Sometimes because they drop out of school at a certain age. So when we speak about children that are non-English speakers, we cannot lump them all together. We need to know which one are we talking about. At any rate, after I graduated from college, I went back to Puerto Rico and I met a man from Reading who I married, and I have been in Reading ever since. And when I came to Reading, there were 400 Puerto Ricans in the city of Reading. Today, the Reading School District is almost 80% Hispanic. At the time, there were only Puerto Ricans, but now we have Colombians, Venezuelans, Mexicans. By the way, Mexicans is a big group also, and from all the countries that speak Spanish. I met the superintendent of the Reading School District, and he told me that they had children in the school district that they didn't speak English, and that they needed me in the school district. So after much soul searching and consideration, I went to Reading to work for the Reading School District. I spent most of my professional life making sure that non-English speaking children and limited English speaking students had the opportunity to learn the academic English language that they needed to be able to succeed in regular classes. The task was not an easy one, but with perseverance and the belief that these children deserve an equal educational opportunity, I would not give up. And today, the Reading School District, as I said before, is almost 80% Latino. Let me for a moment talk about what is happening today. I just heard Representative Miller very eloquently speak about special education. We know that the number of Latino children in special education is disproportionately high. When I went to Reading, most of the children, of those 4 children, Latino children, were in special education. And I found out that they were tested with an English test and by an English psychologist. No wonder they could not pass the test. And the tests are also culturally biased to begin with. So we have those children that are non-English speaking and limited English, but we also have the special education children who are non-English speaking and limited English. That's another issue that we now have to deal with. One of the things that we still have to face is the fact that, let me, for example, say a Spanish family that is totally Spanish speaking with children right now during the pandemic. Who is going to help these children to navigate the technology and the instruction? This morning, I had a very unsettling experience. I am not good with technology because I was not born in the technology era. And I called Morgan to ask her how would I get into to do this talk. And believe me, the experience was extremely frustrating and extremely humbling. And I could not help, all through my experience with Morgan this morning, to think of those children that are now at home and their parent expected to work with them and do not have a Morgan at their house. So what I'm trying to say to you is that we need to address the issue of the parents. I did my doctoral dissertation on parental involvement, and I know how the parents of Latino children feel about education. They feel culturally that school is the children's second home and that the teachers are the second parents. so that when they send their children to school, they're sending their children to the best care possible and that they will receive the best education possible. And when I was doing my dissertation and I interviewed parents and I asked questions about education, every one of those parents would say to me, "Why are you asking me about this? I don't know anything about it. That's up to the school." One parent after another would give me the same question because they certainly did not feel that they had anything to contribute to the education. I know that many people believe that the Hispanic parents don't care about the education of their children. And I'm here to tell you that they do care. They do care like any other parent. The problem is they don't know how to help them. They themselves are, their hands are tied because they are navigating in a situation that is foreign to them culturally and linguistically. Another thing that I want to talk about today is the fact that we do not have the personnel that is being trained to work with these children in the schools, let alone during the pandemic. About 15 months ago, the Human Relations Commission, in their attempt to try to solve some of these problems, convened a meeting with the 15 superintendents of schools that had the highest number of non-English speaking children. During that meeting, it was extremely obvious to me that many of those districts had no idea what to do with these children. And it is because not every district in Pennsylvania has 80% Latino, and they can set up a program like the Reading School District has. Some of those school districts might have 10, 15, 20, I don't know how many children, and they cannot afford, so they say, the personnel to deal with these children. So my question to you is, how are we going to deal with this pandemic with the children when we cannot even deal with it during the school year? And the other thing that I want to say is that unless we work with the parents of those children, as limited as they might be, you are never going to be able to get these students to do the work that we expect them to be doing at home. I'm not saying all of them, but I'm talking specifically about the non-English and the limited English-speaking children. And I'm going to end up by telling you something that has me extremely concerned. And it's the fact that I read that in many of the Latino homes right now, those children that are near high school graduation or 11th or 10th grade are going out to work to support the income of their families because the families do not have the income to be able to maintain their families. Those that are not going out to work are doing babysitting so that the parents can go out to work. What is going to happen to our youth? Do you think that those children are going to want to go back to school when the pandemic is over? I don't have the answers, but I can tell you that this is another issue that we need to be greatly concerned about. Thank you for listening to me, and I will be happy to answer some questions later if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yanks. What Dr. Yanks touched upon with respect to equality in our schools, I would urge educators and administrators to recognize that under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, these children have a right to the same education as their peers. And we need to work with students and their families on an individualized basis in order to make sure that they get the help that they need. And hopefully some of the best practices that our other speakers may share that perhaps might be useful in the disability context could help form the basis of some ideas in working with this population that has also has some needs. For our next speaker, I would like to welcome Paige Yoki. She is a staff attorney with the Education Law Center. She represents students, conducts trainings, and advocates to address factors across the state that contribute to individual and systemic educational barriers. She's responsible for leading the Education Law Center's Philadelphia-based Black Girls Education Justice Initiatives. And she joined the Education Law Center staff in 2017 as an Independence Foundation Public Interest Law Fellow, with a focus on eliminating individual and systemic barriers to quality education for students experiencing homelessness, in the Philadelphia region. Welcome, Attorney Yoki, and I look forward to hearing what you have to contribute today.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Morgan, for putting this together. I have learned so much already, and I'm excited to hear what my fellow panelists have to say. I am Paige Joki. I'm an attorney at the Education Law Center, and I use she and her pronouns. And what I hope to do this evening is sort of situate us going back in time a bit to when the pandemic first started, sort of where we are today. What are some things the Education Law Center has seen that are not going well, and then end with, on a high note, with some promising practice about things that we can all do and school districts can do to best support our children during the pandemic and beyond. And so first, I think it is important to remember that the Pennsylvania educational landscape is very complicated. We have 500 school districts and 176 charter schools. And so educational experiences, even in non-pandemic times, can look very different for children across the Commonwealth, simply because of what they look like and where they live. And we know that the United States education system was designed to be and continues to be anti-poor and anti-Black in ways that harm all of our students. And so with this foundation of inequity, it is no shock that even in times that we're not dealing with a global health emergency, inequities are a part of school conditions that should not exist but do. And so I really appreciate what Representative Miller said about returning back. And so at Education Law Center, we are not comfortable with a return to a normal that doesn't fully serve children and give them the educational environments which they deserve and which they need to thrive at school. And so if we're thinking about what things looked like when the pandemic first was unfolding, it's a challenge for everybody. Every single one of us has been impacted, and our lives have been impended in ways that we couldn't have imagined prior to March, or at least I couldn't have imagined a lot of the ways that my life would be changing. And so when we think about what our families are experiencing, increased economic pressure, navigating the individual and collective grief coming from police brutality and anti-Black racism and the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and many others say their names, and the pandemic causing death and many other types of health outcomes for the students and families that we're charged with serving at the Education Law Center. And so when schools were first ordered to close, the educational experiences of young people across the Commonwealth varied wildly. Some families that I served had more supports when they were in school. They had access to counseling. There were one-to-one devices. Their parents were getting training and appropriate languages about how to navigate new platforms, and folks were really checking in, which is wonderful. And on the other end of the spectrum, there were school districts that were offering children nothing, full stop, nothing, and citing equity concerns that we all know predated the pandemic. And so it is sort of on this backdrop that we find ourselves today. And while the state has issued guidance and schools are reopening in many different ways, the educational experiences that young people are having do differ wildly. And we know that school districts that are mainly serving affluent and white children tend to be the school districts that have been intentionally invested in, and school districts that serve Black and brown children that may not have the same socioeconomic privilege have been subject to historic and current legacies of racism and disinvestment, which create school conditions that are very different and far inferior. And so it is against this backdrop that some important notes need to be said. And the first is that student rights and protections remain fully intact. And while there's some small changes to how the law operates, young people still have rights in the school context that have not been eroded by the pandemic. The Education Law Center has a free resource called the Back to School Guide. If you go to our website or if you email Morgan, you can have it. It has student right evidence-based information for caregivers, for parents, for those who are interested, for advocates about what students' rights are, what you can do if you feel that a student's rights have been violated, and what are steps schools can take and families can take to create the best educational experience possible in these very unfortunate circumstances that we find ourselves in. And that guide is free. You can print it, you can look at it online, and it has a lot of information. If you're wondering what we have done about COVID, there's a nifty COVID box on all of the resources, so you can look directly there about what's new in COVID. For me, who's a little bit more visual, that's really helpful. And so I was asked to speak about sort of what are the things that students need, what are we seeing, and what could be better. So I think the first thing is, what are we seeing? So I specialize in working with young people who are experiencing homelessness, and what we know from the pandemic is there are a lot more children who are eligible for protections under a federal law called the McKinney-Vento Act, which protects students who are experiencing homelessness and make sure they have equal access, that they're able to get in the door, that they're able to get what they need in school, and they're able to stay in the same school even if they're forced to move due to loss of housing. And so what we have seen is that with more students being eligible, a lot of students still aren't being identified by their school districts. And it's the job of the school district to identify which students are eligible and then make sure that they're protected. And so one thing that we've seen is that families are being displaced and then having to move schools, even though they have a legal right to stay in the same school that they were attending. We also get a lot of calls from parents and advocates who are working with students who are in care, also known as foster care. And what we've seen is sometimes those students are subject to illegal waiting periods and not allowed to enroll in school for a period of weeks. And what the law says actually is that students are entitled to immediate enrollment, and immediate means immediate, even without ordinarily required enrollment documentation. And so these are some of the things that we've seen for students who may be forced to have educational disruptions due to physically needing to move from different places. In terms of barriers faced by families who have students who are eligible for special education, we have seen some difficulties with communication with parents. So students and families may not know what they're going to receive in the virtual or hybrid environment, how services are going to be implemented, and how services might look different. So you might have face-to-face counseling when you're at school. You might be able to do virtual counseling while you're remote, but a lot of families aren't being informed about what their rights are, what their IEPs will look like, and what their distance plans, learning plans will look like. And the distance learning plan should specify what services, how you're going to get them in a digital and a hybrid environment, and then it becomes part of the IEP. And then there should be a plan for what happens if students are returning to a physical school whenever that happens, if the school is in digital or hybrid now. And what we've seen is that's been difficult to implement. A lot of families are also very afraid to accept services that require the use of a camera, because we do know that families can be surveilled through their cameras. And so some families are saying no to services because they're afraid of what the school district could see. So for example, if you were to see my apartment in this moment, I may not want you to see all the rooms because maybe things aren't pristine as I would like them. And so for some families, they're concerned that that could result in a referral to DHS. And we do know that sometimes referrals are made based on things that people are seeing that may not comport with the reality of the situation. So for example, if your room isn't pristine, they could have an allegation of neglect. And we know that these things are disproportionately called in for Black and brown families. So there is a fear of, if I accept services, what could the consequences be for my family and for my child? As stated previously, there are also many barriers that are faced by students and families who may not communicate using English. And some of the key barriers that we've seen are families not getting critical information in the languages in which they speak, not being screened for what languages are appropriate to communicate with the family in on home language surveys. And so even if English language instruction is being offered at schools, sometimes the information and the instructions aren't appropriately translated, or they're translated using Google, which is not appropriate and does not have a clear translation, because different languages put words in different orders. So for example, we might say Pink Panther in English, but in Spanish that might be translated to Panther Pink. And so what you'd be getting if you put it into Google is something that is actually not appropriate and does not give families information about their rights. We also see that some resources and other supports like mental health resources and hotlines might not be available in languages aside from English. So we know that everybody is in a really tough situation right now, but resources and investments are not being made equitably, which is resulting in students being harmed and not being able to access the supports that they would need and that they deserve in schools, because the laws that protect them are still very much in place. And lastly, I'll share another one of the barriers that we've seen is that families may not get information on how to have supportive English language services for students, or they might not be being offered at all, which is not acceptable under the law and puts our students in a situation where they are sidelined and forced to watch their peers learn while their needs aren't being met. And so all of these things contribute to an environment that really harms our students and makes it so students aren't being given the educational opportunities that they deserve. And I wanted to also give a special shout out to my wonderful colleague, Sophia Tan at the Education Law Center, who's been facilitating working groups and has provided some of this information to me about what barriers we're seeing, because at Education Law Center, we have a lot of calls. We have a helpline. If you ever need us, call us, but the barriers change on a week-to-week basis. So the things I've shared are some of the background barriers we've seen and also things that are a little bit more cutting edge. In terms of barriers for all students, we have a critical lack of internet. And it is really alarming that families can't get what they need. Even if you are able to get internet, if you're living in a community that has been abused by redlining, you may not have the access to the same types of quality internet. The free internet that you might be offered might not be able to support multiple students, so you can get kicked off. I know that has been a huge problem, or students having to move from place to place. And so they might need a hotspot rather than a tethered internet connection, because if you're displaced on a regular basis, it's difficult to be able to log on. So with all of that said, the picture is pretty bleak, but that doesn't mean that there isn't hope. And so the first thing I'd like to share with you, and if you're interested in this, it's on our website, and also it will be distributed in the resources if you're curious, is called Education Law Center's Online and Hybrid Equity Learning Tool, which is a checklist for schools. And what it does is it encourages families and schools to be thinking about what elements do we need for equitable education that we can apply now and we can apply moving forward when the COVID-19 pandemic has subsided. And so this checklist has 4 important elements. The first is access to remote learning and technology. So do you have the physical things that you need to access programming? The second is quality remote instruction. So what is going into the program? Are your needs being met? If you have specialized needs, you need language services, you need special education services, do you qualify for McKinney-Vento protections? Are those things in place? Do you have the needed home support? So is there an adult who is available to supervise you, who has the support necessary to navigate maybe multiple platforms and the internet and any other materials you might need? Is your family made up of folks who are essential workers who may not be able to be in a physical location with the student the whole day? Is the student themselves an essential worker? So they might need some flexibility there. And the last is degree of engagement. And what that means is, do our families and students have the supports that they need to access online learning in a virtual or hybrid model? And so what this checklist does is it encourages all of us, including parents and students and decision makers and school districts, to think through what is necessary to create the best type of education system that is possible under the current system. And so lastly, I wanted to share a few promising practices that have heartened me and put a smile on my face in these very difficult times. So the first is some school districts are adopting universal screeners to determine what needs a family has that is expansive. So do you have access to food? Do you have a stable place to live? Do you need connection to mental health services? Are you experiencing homelessness and need to be recognized as McKinney-Vento eligible? Are you a student who needs language instruction? What languages can the school communicate with your caregivers in? And these universal screeners have been very effective in making sure that students can get what they need, and also positioning schools as the central part in the community that they face. Schools are amazing parts of our ecosystems, and they are more than just places where students go to learn. They are the provision of meals. They are access to nurses. They are access to counselors, and they are access to amazing teachers and specialized professionals that help kids learn and grow and become the people that they're going to become. And so connecting and having schools have friendly interactions with families that are asking, what do you need? At the start can go a long way. I know some of the families I served received individualized lists of where they could go for food because they were experiencing food insecurity, which was great. Some schools have also been very flexible with families and scheduling meetings and off hours if the students or the parents are essential workers, and that's been wonderful. I know I've attended meetings that are far later in the evening than would usually be possible, but the schools and the families are really coming together and the right choices are being made for the students. And lastly, in the context of serving students who are in foster care or students who are experiencing homelessness, one thing the Education Law Center has been very heartened by is the fact that many students are being permitted, as is required by the law, to stay in their same school, even if they are forced to move because of an experience and a change in placement, be it that they're experiencing homelessness or be it that they're having a change in placement because they're in care. And so all of these signals point to me that we can and should do better for our students, and we have the opportunity now. And I am so excited to hear what others have to say, and I'm happy to stay on to answer questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paige. I think one of the great things of many things that you said that I heard was distance learning plans. That sounds like a great tool for people to be doing and for schools to be implementing distance learning plans, as well as your suggestion relating to addressing privacy concerns for families. And making sure that something is put in place so people don't not want to send their kids to school. So that's wonderful. And I look forward to hearing more from you during the Q&A period. The next speaker that I'd like to invite to speak is Dr. Khalil Isaac. He is the director of the Department of Education Office of School Improvement. He is a career educational leader with over a decade of experience. He has served as a school-based administrator at 3 levels, elementary, middle, and high school in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. Currently, he is serving as the Director of School Improvement for the Pennsylvania Department of Education, where he manages state-level supports and interventions for underperforming schools across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. As a former teacher, dean of students, assistant principal, and as a school district administrator, his experiences have prepared him to support distressed schools and districts across the state. He earned a Bachelor's of Arts in Sociology at Hampton University, a Master's of Science in Curriculum and Instruction and Education Administration from McDaniel College, and a doctoral degree in Educational Leadership at the Partnership Program at Shippensburg and Millersville Universities. He also serves as an adjunct professor of Humanities and Communications at the Pennsylvania State University, the Harrisburg campus. He currently resides in York County. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Isaac.
All right, thank you so much, Attorney Williams, and thank you to the PHRC for convening such a wonderful and much needed and relevant event. And thank you all to all of the attendees for your time on a Friday afternoon to engage in this discussion with us. So as my, and thank you to also my colleagues that are on this panel. It's a privilege to serve on a panel with such esteemed individuals, individually and collectively. So as we know, and as the previous speakers have spoken so eloquently about, is the fact that inequities that existed prior to COVID-19 have been compounded exponentially at various levels. And we know that virtual education and cyber education now is happening not only in just the concentrated areas of the cyber charter school world that Pennsylvania has been part of, or that has been part of the Pennsylvania public school landscape for the past 20 years, but now it's happening not only in local school districts, but also in brick and mortar charter schools as well. So one of the things that I wanted to bring to the table is just to share a little bit about cyber charter schools and what that landscape looks like in the landscape of public education here in Pennsylvania. And as I mentioned, it's not a new phenomenon. It's something that's been It's a process, a program that's been around for over 2 decades. And these are not private schools. These are public schools. These are funded by taxpayer dollars, and they follow the same mandates and laws and regulations that all public schools will follow. Each one of these 14 schools, and currently there are 14 across the state of Pennsylvania, they serve as their own LEAs, or local educational agencies. So think of each Shiber charter school as a mini school district, if you will. Currently, the latest figures that I saw, and this is a very fluid number, right now is serving about 60,000 students across the state of Pennsylvania. And just from the time that the COVID experience happened to now, averages or estimates state that 14,000 students migrated from either a brick and mortar school district or brick and mortar charter school to Shiber charter schools. So, you know, with approximately 1.7 million school children across the state of Pennsylvania, from pre-K to 12 or grade 12, and 60,000 or so at the Shiber charter schools. And that's in addition to any students who are participating in virtual learning experiences in their local school district or in their charter schools. Now, so the landscape is very, very diverse, and we see that cyber education or virtual learning is not anything that's going to go away anytime soon. There's various modalities of learning that take place. So the biggest variance or the biggest differences in the opportunities that's offered in the virtual learning space is synchronous learning versus asynchronous learning. So synchronous learning are live lessons. So that's where the teacher and his or her students will participate in live lessons. Students will be able to interact with the teacher and with one another in real time. And these lessons occur at predetermined times or pre-scheduled times. On the other hand, you have asynchronous learning, and asynchronous learning is where the learning or the teaching and learning process will take place outside of live lessons. So these may be pre-recorded lessons, these may be podcasts, these may be other learning experiences, this may be independent practice, where the student will work at his or her own pace and will utilize either email or Dropboxes or whatever systems or processes that the school has to communicate with the teacher, and the teacher in kind can provide grading and feedback and other learning extension activities or interventions to the students through that process. There are a myriad of different platforms that are out there. Schools are using Zoom, schools are using Google Classroom, Microsoft Teams, and other platforms that are not as popular, not as mainstream, but that services their schools or their district's needs. So with that being said, no two schools or no two school districts are educating their students in the same way, yet all public schools have to ascribe to the same standards or monitored or regulated by the same standards. So with that being said, I venture to say that no two classrooms or no two students the teaching isn't the same or the learning isn't the same, and it's differentiated, and it looks very, very different across our state. One of the resources that I wanted to share, and Attorney Williams was very, very deliberate in her request to ensure that all of us bring something to the table for participants to take away, is I found in the research a very good tool that Education Week released back in March of 2020, so very early in the COVID crisis. And this was a document not only written to educators, but also to parents and students on how to maximize virtual learning for students. And, it speaks to the fact that we all play a part, or we all have various roles to play in this process. So there were 9 tips that were offered, and I'll ensure that that we, if you reach out to Attorney Williams that we will share the document with you. And I just want to briefly go through this because it speaks to a lot of the aspects of or inequities that have been discussed earlier, as well as ones that we haven't covered yet. First things first, the first tip was don't waste students' time. And, you know, it really speaks to the fact that there has to be a differentiation in the delivery of the process, of the teaching process. We can't expect for students that were previously a part of a 7.5-hour workday or 180-day school year to replicate exactly what those experiences would be like face-to-face in a virtual space. So we need to make sure that we're very deliberate, we're very intentional, but that we are not providing students with differentiated learning experiences that is customized to not only their learning needs and their learning styles, but also to the fact that these students are being educated outside of the schoolhouse. Number two, don't go overboard with synchronous teaching. So we, you know, as educators, we need to keep in mind that we don't need to have our fingers at all times on the teaching and learning process, but rather provide opportunities and provide guidance to students that they can acquire knowledge and to extend their learnings independently or even collaboratively where possible outside of the direct direction of the teacher. 3, asynchronous learning offers pacing flexibility. So again, no two students learn the same way or learns in the same style or possesses the same strengths or multiple intelligences as the research mentioned, as the research by Gardner speaks to. So with that, utilize that flexibility to create individualized learning plans, if you will, and not necessarily not just for students with special needs or students with IEPs, but also keeping all students in mind to personalize the learning experiences for all students in every way possible. 4, the parent engagement piece, give parents clear directions. So we know that depending on the age or the generation or the experience of parents, that not all parents are digital natives. So with that being said, there are students that we have, or some of our children are much more tech savvy than we are as parents. So we need to ensure as educators that we're providing clear directions for parents also, and not alienating parents from the teaching and learning process, but engaging them in the process, because the parents now, because of the students being home, especially in schools that are 100% virtual, the touch points are at a much greater level with parents than they are between student and teacher. 5, asynchronous learning can be a little more informal. We spoke to that blends to one of the previous points earlier, but the key point there is that the synchronous learning experience, again, allows for some of those informal activities and some of those social, emotional touch points that teachers can have with students and students can have with one another, whereas the asynchronous learning experience can be more formalized. Subject matters work better in one mode than the other. So we need to not only, as educators, make sure that we ensure that we know the learner, but we have to know the learning. So that pedagogical process of ensuring that we know the curriculum, that we are customizing the instruction that's best suited for our students, and again, meeting all those requirements, where Dr. Jens spoke earlier about cultural relevant pedagogy and culturally relevant instruction. All of that is embedded in that process. Number 7, asynchronous doesn't mean absent. So just because the touch point is not happening synchronously doesn't mean that students aren't learning, that students aren't acquiring knowledge, and that students won't be able to master tasks or skills or activities. Number 8, tailor instruction to your students' needs. Again, the need for differentiation at all levels is very important. And number 9, which is very, very important, teachers don't get frustrated. So again, we're living in unprecedented times, and teachers are being asked to do unprecedented things to be able to support students and families, and know that, we all are going through similar experiences. And the more that we share and the more that we support one another, we'll be able to, we can be able to achieve success through this process. Whatever wave 2 may look like, whatever the rest of the 2021 school year would look like, and even the 21-22 school year, what that will look like, in the horizon, the fact is that if we are frustrated, it does impact our work. It does impact the ability of what we can contribute to students, and students rely on us so much for that sense of academic normalcy, that those social emotional check-ins. And again, students want to get back to schools and to what life or what the new normal will be post-COVID, just as much as teachers and parents do. So again, thank you for the time, and I will be available for the Q&A period later in this session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Disak. I certainly was alarmed the first time that you told me that there was such an increase in cyber learning over this this period of time. It doesn't get any less shocking now. So our next speaker is Dr. Bateman. Dr. David Bateman is a professor at Shippensburg University. He's a former due process hearing officer for Pennsylvania. He earned his PhD from the University of Kansas. He recently co-authored the following books: Principal's Guide to Special Education, Special Education Leadership, Building Effective Programming in Schools, and Current Trends and Issues in Special Education. He was recently a co-editor of an issue of Teaching Exceptional Children, focusing on IEPs. He's the co-founder of the Journal of Disability Law and Policy in Education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Bateman.
Thank you very much, and I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. I wish we didn't have to be here to have this conversation. I wish that, that first, COVID didn't happen, and I wish that all students, regardless of their situation, were receiving an appropriate education. So I just want to start by just addressing that, is that I'm here not because I'm here to help, and I really appreciate this, and I'm honored to have listened to the comments from Dan Miller, Dr. Yingst, Attorney Yockey, and Dr. Disak, because I'm truly impressed with the knowledge and thought that they put into their presentations and the comments that they made. The resources that are being provided to you are wonderful, and you need to make sure that you provide them to others who are not participating, and just get out the information about what is there. It truly is an important part of where we are with providing services. My main goal is just to talk about the requirements especially for kids eligible for special education and related services, and what all public schools, both what you typically think of as bricks and mortar and charter schools, what are the requirements of receiving an appropriate education, and to address this. And I'm going to kind of go a little far afield, but bring it back, because I have some resources that I think will be beneficial to you, and we'll get those to you so that you can, again, share them with whoever might benefit from them. All the resources that I'm going to be talking about are free resources and are available, but people are not always widely aware. People aren't aware of how to get them and and what should be done in order to make sure that we provide appropriate services. So thanks again for the opportunity here, and I appreciate Attorney Williams's organization on this. It's impressive that you're here, and that it's a Friday afternoon. So thank you very much. But when I talk about the appropriate education of kids with disabilities, I'm just going to remind everyone is that it is the primary obligation and requirement of the special education rules that we have at the federal level and the Commonwealth level, is it's a crucial obligation for special education to provide a special education that confers a free, appropriate public education. And I just want to build on what Attorney Yockey just said very eloquently, is that there are some individuals who are not receiving services, and it sometimes makes it difficult to actually provide some of these things. And these kids, these kids have disabilities at no fault of their own. And I think we need to remind ourselves that we need to do everything that is in our power to provide appropriate education for these kids who are just often just trying to make it through the day. And we have this affirmative obligation, but we should do this just to be human beings to provide supports. But the problem is we don't often do that. So let me just really quickly, and I'm just going to I'm not trying to talk down to anyone, but just sort of ground all of us so that we address this. But the federal statute is very clear, is that what do I mean by an appropriate education? Well, it's special education and related services that are provided at public expense, meet the standards of the SEA in our jurisdiction, it's PDE. It includes preschool, elementary, or secondary education, and are provided in conformity with the child's IEP. So I can't emphasize this enough, right? The law that we, as special education, we have has been around since the 1970s. And we've had 2 Supreme Court cases that affirmed that school districts have an obligation to provide an appropriate education. Back in 1982, we had the first case in special education that addressed this issue, the Rowley case. And the Rowley case developed as a part of that a 2-part test that basically asked, has the state complied with the procedures set forth in the law, and is the resulting IEP reasonably calculated to enable the student to receive educational benefit? Recently, the most recent Supreme Court case we've had on special education, kind of bookending, because the Rowley case was the first one and the Andrew case was the second one, the second one inappropriate, but there were other cases on other issues related to this, is the Supreme Court, in a rare unanimous decision, I mean, watch for this in the future, but there's not a lot of unanimous decisions, but in a rare unanimous decision in March of 2017, so that the IEP must aim to enable a child to make progress. After all, the essential function of an IEP is to set out a plan for pursuing academic and functional advancement. This is important, and I really want to emphasize this, because yes, things have changed in the world since March. I remember in April sitting down with school districts and saying, I think we can make it to Memorial Day. I'm not sure which Memorial Day we were addressing at that point, but it does raise an issue as we talk about this, is we're dealing with issues and we've been addressing this, and we need to make sure that kids eligible for special education make progress. So that's what our obligation is, and that's an obligation that we have, and this is not a light obligation. It's something that we need to take very seriously. So when I talk about this, is that all districts have to do this. And there are procedural requirements, there are process requirements, but I really want to talk about the fact that the obligation of school districts has not changed. Full stop. I truly mean this, that students eligible for special education are to receive an appropriate education. And the best thing I can do, the great thing is I was on a call with several districts just before getting on this call, is I work with a lot of school districts and help them with their services. And one thing that I want to...
It was Wednesday, Miss. No, it wasn't. It was Tuesday.
I'm sorry. But one thing I want to make sure is I talk with every single school district that I work with, and I'm working with districts across the state right now, is I make sure that we talk about what worked this past week. And in some places it was a short week. It was a kind of interesting, but in other places it wasn't. And then we talk about what are they going to do differently next week. There is no stopping. There is no, we give up. We are going to keep trying. And that is something that I can't emphasize enough, is that we as school districts and across the state to provide services have to keep trying. There is no giving up. And that is that is not an acceptable answer. It's not legally defensible, but it's also the right thing for these kids. Is the kids deserve an education, and we need to do what we can to make sure that they receive an appropriate education. So if the parents didn't participate in calls, or the kid didn't have access to a computer this week, or there were some Wi-Fi problems, what are we going to do differently next week so that that works? What are we going to do to make sure parents fully participate in IEP meetings if they're Zooming in and they don't like this, or they're having to log in from their job just in a short period of time? What are we going to do to make sure that parents can participate in this and make sure that everyone is still safe? What have we learned? What are we going to do differently? There is no stopping, and we can't allow this to happen. So every single district I work with, what we're just basically the mantra is keep trying, keep trying, keep trying. And I can't emphasize that enough. So there's some resources that we're going to provide for you. And there's some resources that I'm going to talk about that are really beneficial that you need to think about as a part of this. The first resource is, and this is something that I think we can get to you, is a guide on just how to write an appropriate 504 plan. And this is something that I've passed out to a lot of districts. I found a lot of districts did not have a lot of guidance on this. It's about a 60-page document on how to write a 504 plan. My understanding is being used by 13 states and 2 of our territories and how to do this. But it's a document just to help you with this and make sure that kids eligible for Section 504s who are not receiving special education services, that we can make sure that they get what they need. First thing, this. The second thing, and these are free modules. These are things that I put out here because I wrote one of them and helped write the second one, is that after the Enders Supreme Court case in 2017, U.S. Department of Education decided that we needed to provide administrators and teachers training on how to write legally defensible IEPs. So the IRIS Center at Vanderbilt. So if you type in the Google, type in IRIS at Vanderbilt, and then go there, they have these modules on IEPs. One for teachers and one for administrators. I wrote one of those. It went through many layers of U.S. Department of Education checking. So it has the U.S. Department of Education stamp of guidance on these. My understanding is that over 30 states are using this to train their administrators as a part of this. They are great resources, and I can't emphasize enough that you need to make sure that your teams have access to them. And they're completely and totally free, so keep that in mind as a part of this. The next resource, and this is a Pennsylvania-specific resource. Pennsylvania has the Patan Center, Pennsylvania's Training and Technical Assistance Network, is that they've started a series of workshops that they're doing monthly with office hours with some of the staff on supporting students with disabilities in a virtual environments. The abbreviation is SSDVE. So if you go to Patan and type in SSDVE, you have these workshops that Patan has been doing over the past, they started in August, and they're doing them monthly to try to just update about what's going on. The workshop that they just did, in September focused on progress monitoring, how to take progress monitoring data on kids eligible for special education. The workshop that they did in October focused on working with parents and disputes and just making sure that you provide a safe learning environment for all kids and help with this, okay? And the last one, this is a brand new center that's going to focus on progress. It's a U.S. Department of Education funded center. It's the URL is promotingprogress.org. And it's going to be a place that I would highly recommend that you look over the next year or two for additional resources and supports on this. The final thing is, and I forwarded this to Morgan, is an article that I wrote that was on the update on the Enders Supreme Court case. It came out just in June of this past few months ago. June seems like a long time ago now, but it just came out, and so there are important things there. So things that you can get from us are the 504 accommodations guide and how to write a 504 plan, but also an Andrew update that talks about the case and the importance for these kinds of things. The obligation of school districts has not changed. It really has not changed. And this is something we need to pay attention to. I'm a professor at Shippensburg University, and I post all information that I have in updates at a Twitter feed. My Twitter feed is Sped Law Blog, and I'm trying just to keep it. It's all free resources that we're trying to get out important information to make sure that kids with disabilities receive the education to which they're entitled and can help with this. I can't emphasize this enough, but it really is an important part of what we're doing. So I'm gonna step out now, but I'm around for questions. But I just applaud you for first. It's Friday afternoon. Maybe I know the days are starting to run together in a very Groundhog Day kind of way, but that you're paying attention to the education of kids who historically have been neglected and providing appropriate services. You should be applauded for that. And like I said to all the districts that I've worked with today and every Friday that I meet with them, is just to keep trying and make sure that you continue to try and provide appropriate services. So I'm going to turn it back to Morgan and kind of go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bateman. And again, all of these resources can be made available to you in a list if you send me an email. And I've been listing my, my email in the comment section a couple times. So we're going to start with some panel discussion questions. And my first question is for Representative Miller. Representative Miller, can you talk about how can the legislature assist parents, schools, and children, and what kind of information is helpful for us to provide to our state representatives?
Well, look, there's first, what's most helpful is your local school district, okay, right? So obviously you need to be in contact with your local school district. I think every parent knows that, but look, the legislature, there's 253 of us, right? So you also have to figure out exactly what you're trying to do and what your goal is. Your individual legislature, no matter where they are, a rep or senator, should be easy for you to outreach to. A lot of the stuff I'm doing is virtual. Believe me, I would say the overwhelming majority of any party, they're looking to talk with people, especially in their districts. The interesting part about that is going to be what you share on the personal side. Again, keep in mind that most, especially I'll say in relation to special education, most of the legislators, they won't know your experience. They won't really know what it means to try and do speech therapy off of a worksheet with no speech therapist, right? They won't understand that. So you got to try and be sure to explain the realities of that. And it is a personal story to tell. In my opinion, the more personal story you tell, the better. So in relation to parents with it, look, every office, if you go online, we're easy to find. And there are tools online that tell you who your individual rep or senator is. And then there are methods for you to do it. Phone calls, virtual, and in some regards, perhaps impersonal is still an option depending on the scenario in particular. But the key to it all is not assuming that they have the same experience that you have had. And hopefully that will foster a deeper understanding and appreciation as to the challenges that you're facing as a family back at home. So that's how I would do it. I think it's not challenging. Again, while I may have disagreements with some of my colleagues from time to time, overwhelmingly they all want to hear from you. They all want to know what is working, what isn't working, and I think you would be pretty well received no matter where you go.
Wonderful, thank you so much. The next question I have is, what inequities exist currently in Pennsylvania relating to remote learning that parents and faculty should be aware of to address? I'll pose this question first to Dr. Bateman.
Thank you very much. That's a great question. That's a great question. I appreciate it. Is that the inequities that face is that we have a lot of kids who are eligible for special education who, yes, some schools may have one-to-one programs where they may have an iPad, a Chromebook, or some form of computer device, but we have students who are eligible for special education who often may need an aide or someone to work with them very closely with this as a part of this. They may not have the ability to understand where, how to turn on a device, how to move a mouse, how to log on to a Wi-Fi system. So it's these basic things that we take for granted that all individuals know how to do. Some of these individuals actually need prompting on these things. They need an aide to provide assistance, and the aides are not going, or paraprofessionals are not going into the kids' homes and providing these kinds of things. This in addition to, some parents just don't have Wi-Fi. There was an issue this. We noticed this rather dramatically in March, April, and May, is that parents did not have Wi-Fi, or if they were using their cell phone, that there was a cell phone and the cell phone was running up against data caps. Or the issue is we did all these surveys and we found out that parents had a computer at home, but then they didn't realize that, yeah, they answered truthfully, yes, we have a computer at home, but then we found out that parents have multiple kids and they themselves for their work need to be logged onto the computer or device in order to access the content. So it poses a significant problem. This first, we have a knowledge base and a knowledge gap about what's going on. Second, we have issues where kids don't have access to Wi-Fi and other issues. And third, we don't have, some of these kids don't have access to some of the Wi-Fi routers. So there's some districts that have moved their Wi-Fi devices in their buildings so parents can pull into parking lots and access things, or we saw in some of the urban settings where buses were putting in strategic places where Wi-Fi was there. We also assume that the parents have the time to sit there and work with the kids. It's an assumption that parents don't often have the time and availability to do these things. And parents are trying to make it, trying to do it, and trying to provide appropriate education for their kids who they often deeply care about, but they don't often understand, or we haven't provided the appropriate supports necessary to do this. That's a very short answer to a very important question, because it relies on kids receiving education, receiving these access to services for virtual and hybrid kinds of settings, and a lot of things that we did for kids in March, April, and May. I'll turn it over to others and let them chime in on this as well.
You know, Morgan, real quick, if I can, off that, and this is why I think, David, again, we said a couple things about this before. We have to redefine in this state what it means to be ready for school, okay? It is no longer acceptable, no matter where your child goes to school, no matter what school, no matter your zip code, no matter where, it is not acceptable for that child to not have a computer that they can bring home and use at home and access to an internet with a suitable connection. So that's it, right? And we've talked a little bit about this in the legislature before. I have a bill that not only would what the bill does is it works for, it takes every child right now. We have 280,000 roughly kids in Pennsylvania who live in homes challenged by poverty. Okay, that's straight according to the federal line. What my bill would do is it would create a program where the money for that child's technology, that's coming from the state. Forget the schools. All right, so it's coming straight from a separate line that will be funded by the school districts. The schools will have other responsibilities they'll have to make up, but for the 280,000 who are in the most challenged economically, it is in my opinion, our system right now, we're unconstitutional in our support for our kids. That's just a reality. And it's something to which I hope that as we get into a new term, and as we talk about the things that have to be done in education, I'm tired of this sort of fake, to use a term, appreciation or understanding as to what it means to have a child ready for school, and where the state's responsibility is. Every kid needs a computer. That's it. No school district goes around begging. That's it. And we can't have school districts wait weeks and weeks beyond other school districts just because financially they have better means than another. That's the definition of inequity, and it's unacceptable for our kids. Sorry.
I agree. Paige, would you like to add anything to that that discussion? What kind of inequities do you see that are currently in Pennsylvania relating to remote learning?
I really appreciate all that's been said, and I really think that one of the things that I'm taking away from the experience with the pandemic is that we can't go back to having a foundation of inequity. And I think it's really wonderful that we're having this conversation. Sorry if you can hear the helicopter above my house. And I do think that there are a couple of inequities that I just wanted to touch on very briefly. One of the things that I've noticed is a lot of communication styles with districts that pose barriers to families. So a promising practice is to make sure you're communicating with families via letter, on the internet, making robocalls, using apps to communicate with folks, because one of the barriers we've seen is that sometimes districts will post information only online. And so if you don't have it, it's not possible. And sometimes you need multiple things in order to actually complete the task you're seeking. So for example, enrollment has been a big barrier. Many kids who haven't yet been in school or need to enroll in school actually can't get into school because of barriers that have been set up by the district. And this is really troubling, especially because compulsory school age and changes to that went into effect during the pandemic. So now, regardless of where you are in the Commonwealth, from 6 to 18, students need to be enrolled in school. And so one barrier that I've seen is online enrollments only. And so for our families who do not yet have a device, who do not yet have internet access, are unable to enroll. And so one thing that some schools have done, which I think is amazing, is had multiple ways to enroll. I can enroll over the phone if I have a phone. I can come to a community site where I might get food or medical attention and fill out a form which I can put into a Dropbox, which is great. I can use online enrollment, but some of the ways that schools are engaging with families are really troubling. I know I personally tried to enroll students using online platforms, and I have every resource available to me. I can access the platform, I can read it, I have legal expertise in how to enroll students, and sometimes I can't even do it. And that doesn't mean I'm perfect or smarter than parents. It just means that there are barriers. If even with all the technology, you can't actually effectuate what you're trying to do. And so I'm hopeful that as we move forward this discussion, the thought of how does one get into school can be interwoven, and also what happens if families need updated information and yet schools might need to expand the ways they're communicating to make sure that the communication is actually accessible.
Wonderful. Dr. Desac, do you have anything you'd like to add about the disparities that you're seeing that we should be aware of?
Sure. So a lot of it has been covered, but just to complement some of the information, a recent study at Penn State University said that stated that there could be as many as 35,000 disconnected households and up to 500,000 disconnected or underconnected Pennsylvanians across the state. And that, again, those numbers can be very, very fluid. So, some of my colleagues already mentioned the fact that, the intermittent or unreliable Wi-Fi or access to Wi-Fi. Also, the teaching and learning process, the educational process is a very relational process. The relationships that are established between students, the relationship that's established between teachers and students, the relationships that the collaboration and the professional learning communities that are established among educators. And a lot of those barriers now have been put, and those walls have been put back up because now everybody's back in, silos due to virtual learning spaces are happening at home and in other places across Pennsylvania. The inequity is around the social emotional needs for students. Although there's an absolute intent for schools and for educators to provide for the social emotional needs of students. Again, we address the academic needs through the virtual learning, and sometimes the social emotional pieces are face-to-face. You can't replicate that virtually or online. Inequities around how we explicitly teach students how to use technology. We can't come to the assumption that all students know how to use technology in an appropriate manner. It's a very, very different way to utilize technology for entertainment or recreational purposes, whether it's social media, YouTubing, and that sort of thing, as opposed to conducting research, to produce writing virtually, to engage in chat rooms in a meaningful way, and all of those other nuances that are now part of virtual learning spaces that some students may or may not have the explicit knowledge of doing so prior to the COVID experience. And last, I wanted to mention the fact that we are asking educators at this time to produce effective and high quality teaching experiences in manners that they may not have been trained in teacher preparation programs. I can speak from personal experience that technology wasn't explicitly infused in any of my educational training or programming until I began my doctorate work. So with that being said, teachers are now learning on the fly. Teachers, districts are working on professional development experiences and that sort of thing. But some of this may not have happened in a very proactive way. Some of it may have happened as a reaction to current circumstances. So, when we look at, are all teachers prepared or educators prepared to deliver this high quality virtual learning experiences that we expect them to, but ensuring that they have the financial resources, the support, the time, and all of those other pieces. We're asking them again, and we ask them all the time to fly the plane while they're building it, or build a plane while they're flying it. I hope I said that correctly. But with that being said, we're asking them to do yeoman's work. And again, the educational experiences for our students are so critical, but there are exponential challenges that exist.
Some of the things that I'd like to point out that I think is important for everybody to recognize is that not all students with disabilities are going to be looking to be educated in a brick and mortar setting. So you're going to have to develop plans to serve students where they choose to be, where they are. And in addition, I think one of the things that we also have to be prepared for is there are students that we have not yet identified as students with disabilities that are in these online learning environments, and there's still an obligation for districts and teachers to reach out to those students and make sure they're being identified and that they're getting the services that are needed. And that's even more of a challenge in these times where teachers are spread very thin and the student isn't physically in front of you. And lastly, I think it's important for teachers and administrators to understand that the curriculum that has been previously developed and perhaps in some ways been around and being used successfully for years is not necessarily built for the online environment. So there are a lot of considerations that need to be made when switching, to an online platform specific to students that have additional needs. So, I think we need to be much more careful that we don't let people slip through the cracks and be extra vigilant in making sure that we identify students. And also, at the end of the day, whether we're talking about a student with a disability or whether we're talking about a student of color, we need to be providing students with equal access to their education. So, that might mean providing additional accommodations that we need to think about, or it might mean thinking about the way our policies and practices impact certain populations, perhaps more than others. So, now that we've identified some of these challenges, I'd like to talk about some best practices. We're going to give you the resources that we were able to develop or to come up with as a group, but I'd like each of the speakers to touch upon some of the better best practices that they've seen and responding to students in the digital environment. At this time, let me start with Paige.
Thank you. I really have appreciated what I've seen some school districts do, and this was touched on a little bit earlier in the session, which I think is a great idea, is to have folks collaborate. I've noticed that there have been some very thoughtful collaborations among people that are coming together and asking the question, what does this child need and how can we best serve them, and how is the best way to serve them in this moment? And so I've been heartened by seeing folks coming together and professionals in districts sharing what works and what doesn't, both in the district and across districts, because there are some really great ideas that don't cost money, but change the way that students and families are engaged with by the district. I think another really promising practice that districts have been using is delivering materials directly to students. So many of our families may themselves be at increased risk for COVID or may not have the means to provide for transportation. And so some districts have been hand delivering devices at a safe distance if the device doesn't work, making sure families have hotspots, and also delivering other things that students might need. One way that schools have been doing this in some districts, which I think is great, is taking a survey of what a student needs and then connecting them directly to those resources, like I mentioned a little bit earlier. But sometimes you can bring the resource to the student, which I think has been absolutely fabulous. And one other thing that I will say, and then I will hand it over to some other folks who I know have some great practices. I was very impressed by what I heard on our pre-prep call, so I'm excited to hear some more, is school districts that are really using their websites as community hubs. So are you having information about where to get food, where to get resources, where to get mental health supports, and then going out into the community and posting them? If there's a food site, for example, have information about how to register and how to get support at school. If there are medical clinics that families are frequenting or COVID testing sites, it might be a good idea to also see if school-based materials can be there. Because if schools are meeting families where they are, it's more likely that families are going to get that information and also make the connection that schools are very important resources in the community, as they know, but that are there for them in places that they might not expect. So thank you for your time, and I'm eager to answer some more questions later on.
Dr. Dusak, do you want to add to that? What have you seen some best practices? I know you work with all the cyber academies across the Commonwealth.
Sure. So I'm going to slightly answer the question in a different way. I want to talk a little bit about some of the resources that the Department of Education under the leadership of Governor Wolf have partaken in order to support schools and families across the state. One of the things that under the GEARS initiative is to partner with public libraries across the state to create Wi-Fi networks, especially in high needs communities, increasing the number of hotspots and Wi-Fi access points that could even be loaned to the community through the public library system. Partnering with the PBS network to provide 4 hours of uninterrupted programming per day that's aligned with Pennsylvania standards as a supplement to the teaching and learning experiences that are occurring in school districts. Some of the other resources that the state has provided is a series of resources called Creating Equitable School Systems, which is located, can also be found on PDE's website. This is supporting schools as well as students and families in the remote learning spaces. Some of the key areas that are in these resources are general equitable practices, self-awareness, data practices, family community engagement, academic equity, and disciplinary equity. You can also find that available in PD's Equitable Practices Hub, which is also available on our website as well. So there's a host of resources that, again, that were mentioned and that weren't mentioned. I invite you to visit the PDE's website for more resources and for more details of the resources that I mentioned as well.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Bateman, do you have some information that you'd like to add about best practices?
Yes, but it's hard to follow the two people that just did such a nice job. So I appreciate that. And I just want to make sure I tee that up. The best practices that I've seen is the realization that many kids have experienced trauma or stress as a result of COVID. So what they've done is the districts have done a pretty good job of training their general education teachers to look for kids who may not have been receiving special education related services previously, to look and see whether the needs have risen to where they need additional supports. So they start with the realization that the districts obviously have a child find obligation, but they're working to train the general education teachers and principals relating to this. So they're starting to help with this and help and pay attention to this. So keeping that in mind is the first thing. The second thing that I've seen that is working really well, we've seen some districts who are been very good about documenting all efforts to communicate with families. They have some Google Docs that they keep track of what's going on, and little tickers that they kept in there so that they're aware that if they haven't heard or contacted with a family in a few days, that they know they need to do something like maybe drive by and put a letter in the mailbox, or another call, as opposed to just shooting an email out. But basically it gets back to the fact of what I was saying earlier, is there's try different ways of this. But they need to think about this, is be aware of what's going on. The third thing is that districts have trained more of their teachers to provide homebound instruction. Kids who historically may have gone to school who had disabilities such as diabetes or asthma are now susceptible to higher risk of having COVID. And so they're needing homebound instruction. So they have lined up more homebound instruction teachers as a part of this to help meet and address some of these needs. So it really is an important part of where we are with this. And the last one is just really interesting about this, is that there have been districts that have done really good training about how to facilitate parents' participation in meetings, and trying to help with this process to make sure that parents can have things like this. This includes parents who maybe have a hearing impairment, a visual impairment, time requirements, for parents whom English is not their native language. They've done a variety of things as a part of this. But those are some things that really do actually help as a part of the team efforts to make sure that what we're doing is providing appropriate services. This, in addition to what the speakers right before me just said, is that we need to think about all these different things as a part of what's going on, and make sure that it's not just the special ed staff that's doing this, it's also the general ed staff, and it's the principals and the administrators are aware of these things. And they're noticing and paying attention to when kids may have problems. It doesn't necessarily mean that all these kids that are having problems are going to get special education, but at least they're now on they're on our radar screen, so that we can continue to address and monitor what's going on and pay attention to what they are. So those are just some basic things that I've seen, in addition to what was nicely stated before. Just keep track of all those things, because the one that I think stands out the most is the communication log with parents. If they haven't heard from a parent in a few days, or the kid's been dropped off the radar screen, there is that we do a better job of kind of rising to the level that we need to figure out a better way to communicate with the parent. And I say, go to where the parent is, how they communicate. Is it through texting? Is it through phone? Is it through email? Is it a letter, or someone making a personal call to the parent's house? Whatever we can do, go to where the parent is and make sure we kick it up that way. Back to you.
Apologize, I was on mute there.
That's okay. That's okay.
While you're on that subject, if you could elaborate a little bit, you authored a resource for a development of 504 plans, which again is a tool that we'll be making available. And what I really liked about that guide is that your guide kind of lists out particular individual disabilities and common strategies that that educators can use with that particular disability. So for instance, if you have a child with ADHD, here are some of the most common kind of accommodations that could be provided. And I know that's, this is going to be part of the new book that you've got coming out in January, but can you share some insight into what types of accommodations could be particularly effective in the online environment, with particular types of students?
Oh, absolutely. And the reason I developed that was that we often found that it was school counselors who were doing the writing or leading of 504 plans and development, and they didn't have a lot of training in this. And so what I did is I basically wrote a section, and you guys can get this, and it's a free resource. Yes, it's going to be coming out and it'll be part of a book. So we're shilling it now before I have to start charging you guys. But what I did is it talks for the first couple pages about the difference between accommodations versus modifications, then a step-by-step guide on how to actually write a 504 plan. And then I live in Carlisle. And so what I did is I surveyed many of the districts around me and asked what are the most common disabilities which they were writing 504 plans. And then what we did is for each one of them is we kind of gave a broad description. There are about 30 different disabilities we have as a part of this. A broad description of what the disability is, 3 valid websites to go for additional information, then 25 to 30 possible accommodations for that specific disability. So if someone were to go into a 504 plan a meeting, all they would have to do is read that one page on that specific disability. And now they're in the ballpark to talk about the issues with the parent, alleviate their stress, and talk about what's going on. So some of the issues that you were seeing, for instance, we're seeing some kids, we're having to write and think about kids who may need more prompting. For instance, ADHD, they may be on a Zoom call, and they may need a little more prompting as a part of this. Or kids who may need a little bit more wait time in order to process questions. Or kids who may need more instructional guidance about this is going to be happening. This is the first step. This is the second step. This is the third step. This is the fourth step, breaking things down into manageable tasks for some individuals. I haven't hit across any specific disability because most of these, that document was written pre-COVID, and we were living in a very different world. It came out almost exactly a year ago. But what it did is it thought about where we are with this. But there are some important things we need to think about for all kids. And all kids is just trying to think about what can we do to provide appropriate assistance for them. Now, again, that's not answering the question specifically for you, but what you can think about is like some accommodations, okay? Like make sure you have clear expectations. Short breaks every 10 to 15 minutes for the students, cues for the students, positive reinforcement for what's going on to do where we are at this. Have the kid think about distractions that they may have in the background as a part of this, because it's amazing how many kids that I'm Zooming with as part of the work I'm doing who are Zooming from their kitchen, and the parent is working on a meal behind them, and the kid there's a TV on, and there's a dog. Allow extra time for assignments, written instructions with oral directions, with specific directions about where to turn in their work, and then training for where we can go on this. The guide has suggestions targeted to individual disabilities, but those just basic steps of how to actually participate in a Zoom session or an online Google Hangout or whatever methodology that's being used actually help everyone. So that's the important thing. And we have to keep that in mind. So, okay.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. My next question is for Commissioner Yangst. Could you talk to me about what considerations schools should keep in mind when serving students who speak English as a second language, specifically in the digital environment? What kind of things should they be watching out for? Can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Can you hear me?
Now I can.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. First of all, I want to say that I was very impressed with the presentation of Dr. Bateman about the special education students. And I have to say, even though I might be the voice in the wilderness, that, you know, we have a Supreme Court case of the Lau versus Nickel, which became the Supreme Court case for the education of non-English speaking children. And those guidelines have not gone away. And those guidelines are to be adhered and enforced just like the special education guidelines. I know that the Department of Education have some guidelines. I don't know how they are enforced in the state, However, I'm going to be asking some question from Dr. Khalil in a moment. Once again, I have to say that the educational issues of the non-English speaking children in Pennsylvania are different from any other student in the state. And we continuously talk in generalities and do not take in consideration the educational needs of the Latino children. Before the pandemic, we know that these children were not receiving an equal educational opportunity because the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission have had cases against school districts that were not addressing to the needs of those students. And there are many other districts in Pennsylvania that are not addressing the educational needs of these students. We know that we are always told that it's because we do not have the staff available, and they could not hire Spanish-speaking teachers. We do not need Spanish-speaking teachers to teach the non-English speaking children. All you need is a teacher that has a rudimentary knowledge of Spanish and that has the heart to work with these students, because they are not easy students to deal with because of their educational background, might not be what the other students in the class are. And as long as these students are in classrooms with English-speaking students, they are not going to be receiving an equal educational opportunity. Again, I will say that for our non-English speaking children, it is very difficult, especially, if they have learning disabilities or the special ed children. It is very difficult for them to learn in a language that is not their own. And so we are saying that the school districts have to specifically have a plan during the pandemic and before on how to educate these children. One of the suggestions that I have is, would it be possible for the local school districts to go to the local television stations and ask for some educational time where they will have some videos or some person that will, in Spanish, educate the parents on what's going on during this pandemic, because many of the parents don't even know what's going on. They don't even know the services that are available. Another suggestion that I have is that we have some high school students that are totally bilingual, bicultural, and we could use those students to help the parents of those children to help with the children. So if you do not have the teachers, maybe we should be looking at training young people who are bilingual, bicultural to help in the process of helping these children. During this meeting, I have not heard any best practices on how to educate the non-English speaking children. And I also heard Dr. Khalil speak about that you have some pamphlet about how to minimize virtual learning for students. Is that pamphlet in Spanish? Is that accessible to the Spanish-speaking population? So again, my concern for these children is very, very grave, and I do not see, please forgive me, but I do not see that we are really addressing the needs of these children.
Thank you, Commissioner Yangst. So noted. The next question that I have, and I certainly can follow up with you later regarding the Spanish conversion with the documents from the PDE. The next question for the group is, what can parents do to help, bring these kinds of problems to the faculty or teachers and administrators' attention when they're having difficulty? And Paige, I'll put the question to you.
Sure. So one thing that is important to note is that schools are responsible for upholding the rights of children. And so oftentimes when I'm working with families, they may be concerned about raising a concern with the school because they're not sure exactly what legal words to use. And the important part is if there is an issue, you should let the school know. What I find is most effective is sending an email and then calling if you have internet access, or calling and then following up in an email. And so families should never be shy about reaching out to the school about something that they need or something that feels strange, because I always say to advocates and to parents, trust your gut. If something seems off, it might be. It also might not be permissible under the law. And so while we're working to dismantle school systems that don't serve or can't serve students fully because of the nature of how they were created if they don't change, I think it's really important for families to know what their rights are. And I'd refer you back to the Education Law Center's Back to School Guide if you're curious about, well, what are my rights? I'm not really sure what they are. And another thing that's really important, I think, that parents can do, especially in pandemic times, and caregivers, is make sure the school has updated contact information. I was smiling really big during the conversation about the call logs, and I'm sorry, like, you can't see me because I muted my video, but that's a fantastic idea. So make sure the school has updated information. If your cell phone number changes, if your email changes, if your address changes, having an open line of communication is great. And if there's a staff person that you particularly like, see if the school could designate that person as a point of contact for you, especially for our families who may not be able to communicate with all staff for a variety of reasons. Maybe they work at off hours. Maybe they speak a language where interpretation and translation is necessary. Make sure that folks are getting what they need the first time. And a great way to do that is make sure that schools have updated information for you. And if you have a question, please ask. If something has gone very sideways, however, and it seems like the communication is broken down, there are resources for you in the community. The Education Law Center is one of those resources. Please feel free to reach out to us if you feel like you've exhausted your options and things are still not going right. We're happy to work with you. Calling us does not mean somebody gets sued. It means you get information. And so please know that we're here, and other folks on the call are also here if you have questions about, I'm not really sure if that's okay to do. And be sure the school can contact you.
Definitely. I certainly echo that. PHRC employees are also available to answer those kinds of questions for members of the public, if that's okay to do. Paige, also, if you could touch on, you do work with a lot of families who make these inquiries to the district about assistance. What can educators do or administrators do to respond appreciatively to inquiries, or to proactively screen for needs and let parents know what can be provided?
So I love an appreciative inquiry. That's looking at things in the glass half full. So what resources do we have that we can use for moving forward? So a lot of times I hear families have things said about them that are difficult for me as an advocate to hear, and very difficult for the parents and families to hear, like students are unmotivated, or they're not coming to school, or they're not trying. And for many of our students and families, they're in situations which are very difficult and they do not have the needed supports to actually access school. So the first thing is everybody's got to check their language about how they're talking about students and families. In addition, districts can make it part of their procedure to do proactive screening. One promising practice I really like is asking families, what do you need now? And do you see your needs changing? Because families have great knowledge of what they need. Maybe they know that they're not going to be able to stay in the same place next week, so they're going to be moving, or their phone's going to be off, or internet's going to change. And so communicating these needs to the school can be really important, and schools, if they're asking, can do a lot to sort of troubleshoot problems before they happen. Another thing that they can do to appreciatively navigate families is also just what we all should be doing in this time, is just understand that the pandemic is really hard and people are really trying, and there are going to be hiccups. And so having flexibility is something that's really important. If it's not working to call on the phone, send an email. If it's difficult to reach a person, consider sending a letter. And those are things that schools can do to really make a difference, and to let families know that they're there for them. I think that the importance of relationships, as mentioned before, can't be stressed enough. And if you have a caring and thoughtful relationship with families, are more likely to come to you when there are needs, and the school is more likely to respond to those needs in a positive way if they have a good relationship with the family and have command over what's going on.
Those are great tips. Certainly, I'll add that what we see at the PHRC oftentimes, whether we're talking about an education case or an employment case, is parties who have communications that broke down. So a lot of times, you can avoid things like litigation by having these good communication skills and, keeping the line of communication open. The last question that I have for all the panelists tonight is, what kinds of things should parents be telling schools that kids are struggling with? What kinds of things can they be asking for? And how about we start with Dr. Desac?
So I think the key premise to your question, and not to answer it in the most simplistic terms, is, parents should ask questions and be comfortable to advocate on behalf of their children. Insist on a clear communication plan, with your child's teacher to understand, different nuances of the operations of the classroom. How will assignments be turned in? How's homework collected? How is feedback given? What is the preferred method of communication? Is it by text message, emails, phone calls, whatever have you? So asking those good questions that will help parents to understand not only the operations of the classroom, but to also allow parents to be empowered to be able to assist their children at home. Parents should be asking schools not only as to how they're meeting the academic needs of the children, but also those non-academic needs, those character education pieces, those social emotional pieces, all of those non-tangible nuances that are very important to making sure that we're educating the whole child. And to also ask for suggestions for resources as to what the schools see that can be provided for the children at home to reinforce, not only to extend learning opportunities, but to also provide any type of interventions or remediations. Parents should be very, very comfortable and hopefully willing to not only foster good communication and to foster the engagement, but to ensure that the engagement is an effective two-way engagement between the school and the home.
Wonderful. Dr. Bateman, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sack. That was a great summary, and I really appreciate that. So, if you have an opportunity to listen, pay very close attention to what he just very nicely stated. The next thing is, parents, trust yourselves. If you think something's not working, if you think something's not right, make sure you let other people know about this. We're living in a very different world right now than we were living just a few months ago. And if it just doesn't seem right to you, it doesn't seem correct, talk to others, and maybe the teachers can give you more guidance and assistance about what needs to be done or things that can be changed, or there may be actually something that's really wrong. So just trust yourselves. Parents often know what's right for their kids. So pay very close attention and trust what's going on, and pay attention to what you can do to make sure that your child receives the education of which they need to do in order to make progress. That in addition to all the wonderful things that Dr. Desac said. But the schools won't know if there's a problem unless you tell them. So make sure if you have an issue, find someone in your school district that you feel comfortable with, either emailing, give them a call, just let them know about what's going on. But then trust yourselves. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And before we close, I'd like to ask if Representative Miller has anything he'd like to add to the panel discussion.
Thank you, and it was so great to hear from so many tonight. Look, teachers had a tough job before COVID. They have a tougher job now. That overwhelmingly is the case. Paraprofessionals, we talked a bit about, sort of like how can you see best practices in schools. I always gauge the paraprofessionals, right? What type of support are they having? What type of skill set are they bringing in? What are they ready for distance learning themselves? All too often, I find that paraprofessionals in too many school districts are the afterthought, when it comes to preparation. The inequality question, one of the things here, besides from the tech stuff we talked about, is the rise of these, pods, right? Pods can be good in a lot of ways, assuming they're done safely and healthy, but that also assumes you had the money to do them, and that's a whole nother issue. I get concerned about the sort of the stratosphering of equality, and what our public education system could look like within 12 months. And it took a long time for us to get to certain things. It will take less time to unravel it. And that still is a paramount concern. And that's where I think we have to continue to push our leaders, both at the school board level, the local level, the state, the federal, to continue to prioritize the things here that mean so much to our families, to our future. And that while there are a myriad of problems for us to deal with, there's no doubt what cannot be lost is, again, these challenges here in relation to our schools, and in particular in relation to our special education kids and our Spanish-speaking students as well. That was referenced multiple times. All good points to be put up. Again, I'm not really interested in yesterday, right? We're interested in tomorrow, and whether it's a Build Back Better or some other language that you want to talk about there with it. February was not the zenith for most kids. For special education in the state of Pennsylvania, we still have to see that, and we still have to make it. And that's what I hope part of this conversation does. So thank you for the moment, just to say a couple final words. And I, again, appreciate the opportunity to listen to so many fine speakers tonight.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And again, my email address, which has been in the chat, is morganwill, MORGAN, WILL @pa.gov. And, anyone who is interested in the resources mentioned by any of the speakers today, please, shoot me an email and I'll be happy to forward those resources along. In addition, we tried to get a lot into this 2-hour period today. So I recognize that there may be questions that you may still have, or you may have them, a week from now. Please feel free also to email me. And if anyone has any specific problems that they're having themselves, email me as well, and I'll get you to the right regional attorney across the state for assistance. So thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. And I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you soon. Take care.
Thank you.